I've also noticed just personalities between a lot of the different places, like you said, are very, very different. I mean, in New York, people are a little bit more crass and a little bit more blunt, and that's the whole East Coast. And on the West Coast, everyone's a little bit more relaxed. And down in Texas, everyone's just very prideful and kind of a mixture of relaxed and blunt.
Yeah, that was one of the first things that I noticed when I moved to Texas. I always told people it was like the happy medium between like Minnesota and Connecticut, because people in Texas are very laid back, but but they also, depending on who you meet, the lifestyles can be very, very similar to those who are in New York and Connecticut. And I know, when one thing that I think is extremely helpful and relevant with living in so many different places is that if we have a role that is, let's say, in New York City, and yeah, we're here in Dallas, but we, recruit positions all over the country, and it makes it so much easier to like introduce those conversations to people if you know and kind of can anticipate what their personality might be like.
Oh, exactly.
So, if let's say, if I were to call a candidate or just in general, trying to expand my network and call someone who maybe lives in, Brooklyn or Manhattan or whatever, and I can call and say, all right, so I know all the sports teams. I know like where things are in the city. So if they say, oh, I live here and here, it's like, yeah, I may have to Google a couple of things, but at least I've been to New York City, so I can kind of have like an idea in my head of like what they might be talking about. And it's just so much easier, and I think more beneficial to like be able to navigate that conversation as a recruiter, because obviously, like you mentioned, someone from the West Coast may kind of, navigate or make the conversation go in one direction, versus in New York, like they're very direct, or in Connecticut, they may have like different preferences on what they want to know first. Like, okay, like where's the job located? Is it remote? I know that was a huge thing with COVID, where every single person that I called on the East Coast, because they had a different experience, with the pandemic in New York City than they did anywhere else in the country. And they were, the first requirement was, I need to be able to work remote indefinitely, because that's important to them, versus, other parts of the country where that may be, the second or third thing that's most important to them. So it was really, it's kind of weird to call someone and say, okay, this person went to a school that I'm familiar with, or they live in this part of New York that I've been to 3 or 4 times. And it just helps you really build that rapport with the candidate and kind of put yourself in to their shoes before you even talk to them and get to know them a little bit more.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I even experienced that as soon as like yesterday. I was talking to a candidate, and they lived out in California, and they were talking about they're actually visiting Houston today. So he was like, I'm going out of town. And I was like, oh, yeah, where are you going? He's like, actually, Houston. I was like, well, I live about six hours away from there, but it's going to be pretty crappy when you come down here. And he was like, what? And I was like, yeah, it's going to be really, really hot and humid. And he was like, well, I'm in San Diego right now. And I was like, oh, man, well, everything's going to be super cheap when you come down here. You're going to love it. You're going to come. You're going to get some papados. And just started listing off all of the things, like all of the food that we have down here. He was like, I've heard of a couple of these places. And I was like, well, Whataburger, it's like really greasy In-N-Out, which is the main place they go to in California. And if I hadn't been there, I wouldn't have known that. Right. And it's just connecting over something as simple as food and the price of things, and being able to be like, oh, you could come down here and you could get like 4 or 5 dinners for the price of one up there. And we just cracked jokes about that back and forth for a little while. And turns out I actually grew up in a very similar place to where he was living, previous to where he lives right now, which was, I lived in Folsom. So that's like near the Sacramento area. And I guess he had recently moved to like Southern California. So we were getting to talk back and forth about just the cultural differences in his workplace between Southern and Northern California. He's like, oh man, like they used to be so strict and everybody was like hustle and bustle. I was like, yeah, like New York. He was like, yeah, exactly like New York. I was like, well, now that you're in the South, it's a little bit more relaxed. And he's like, yeah, everyone's like surfer dudes. They're like, oh, we don't really care about timelines. Like you could show up 5 minutes late and it doesn't really matter. But in Sacramento, people would be 20 minutes early and they'd be mad if you were 5 minutes early only. I'm like, yeah, it's the same way as New York. So just being able to connect over those little things, I wasn't able to have like the perfect position for him, but at the end of the day, I was able to say, hey, like, let's stay connected. And he was like, oh, yeah, I'm coming out to Dallas in a couple of months. Let's go grab lunch. And now it's someone that, even though we couldn't help them out immediately, we could potentially help them out in the future because we were able to build a personal relationship.